I was surrounded by people who, by their own admission, were doing damage to themselves. They were pushing their bodies too far, numbing their minds, and slowly wounding the very gift that made them special. According to Teena Marie, she watched artists she admired tear themselves apart in slow motion. Rick James, the loudest of them all, used to laugh that his music came from a place not of this world. It sounded like a joke, a wild rock star line. But no one understood how close to literal he might have been until Teena finally opened up about what she claimed she saw. She said there were nights when Rick would stop in the middle of a sentence, mid-laugh even, and turn his head sharply toward a corner of the room. His eyes would lock on empty space, and he would speak under his breath as if carrying on a conversation with someone standing there, someone only he could see. On the night he nearly died from an overdose in 1981, a nurse later claimed Rick screamed and thrashed as though invisible hands were dragging him under the hospital bed. In 1993, a studio engineer swore that Rick stepped out of the vocal booth with tears streaming down his face, his voice shaking as he whispered, "I already signed, I can't go back." For decades after, the rumors clung to Rick James like a second shadow. People whispered about some kind of bargain he hinted at, a presence he once suggested was protecting him. They talked about nightmares he swore were not just dreams. The industry, as usual, stayed silent. His friends dodged questions or changed the subject. And Teena, the person closest to his private world, carried a story she said weighed on her for years. Now she is finally speaking on it. And what she has chosen to reveal doesn't just add a new chapter to Rick James's legend. It rearranges the story entirely. Chapter 1. 1978. The Night of the Offer. People remember the music. They remember the album covers, the shows, the swagger. Almost no one talks about the room. What Teena Marie eventually described forces us to rewind everything to the very beginning, before the fame fully exploded, before the scandals hardened into headlines, before the madness, as Teena put it, swallowed Rick whole. Back to 1978. Back to the night some fans now refer to, in half-joking, half-nervous tones, as the offer. It reportedly happened in the Hollywood Hills, inside a mansion Rick James rented while recording his breakout album, Come Get It. The house sat alone on a slope of dry, brittle earth, ringed with dead palm fronds that scratched across the ground whenever the wind picked up. And according to people who visited, that wind never really stopped. It rattled the windows like there was always someone outside trying to get in. Guests said the place held a strange, suspended stillness even on warm nights, like sound had trouble settling, as if the walls didn't want to absorb any of it. That particular night, Rick kept the guest list small. 2 Motown staffers, a dealer he reportedly trusted far more than he should have, and Teena Marie, who had only just started writing songs with him but already felt pulled into his orbit. She later said that from the instant she stepped through the front door, the energy in the mansion felt wrong. The lights flickered a little too often. The air inside felt a few degrees colder than the summer air outside. And Rick kept glancing over his shoulder, not at the guests arriving, but toward the hallway, as if someone else had shown up earlier and was waiting out of sight. Around 11 p.m., Rick quietly slipped away. He walked down the long hallway, took a right at the end, and opened the last door, a door no one else had been allowed through. It was the room he always kept locked. The same room he once joked was where the spirits hang out. People had laughed when he said it. According to Teena, some of them stopped laughing years later. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. Then 2. Teena went to the door and knocked. No answer. A Motown rep, mentioned only as D, in later rumors, tried the knob and pulled his hand back, startled. He reportedly said the metal felt ice cold, like it had just been lifted out of a freezer. From inside the room, there were no footsteps, no movement. Just a low, steady vibration like the hum of distant electricity, or the faint sound of someone breathing very quietly on the other side of the wall. At 2:17 a.m., after hours of silence, the locked door finally opened. Rick stepped out slowly, moving like someone emerging from a deep trance. He stared straight ahead, not really focusing on anyone in the hallway, as if his attention was still tethered to whatever had been in that room. His eyes were wet, but Teena insisted they didn't look like he had been crying. She said they looked scorched, as though he had been staring directly at something too bright or too dark for far too long. He didn't speak at first. He just stood in the hallway, chest rising and falling in quick, sharp bursts, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly at his sides. When he finally did speak, his voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. "I'm untouchable now." No one there knew what he meant. No one wanted to be the first to ask. Teena later described that moment as the image she could never shake. She said Rick looked both relieved and terrified at the exact same time, like a man who had just shaken hands with something he knew he should never have greeted. According to the people present, the house started misbehaving right after that. A light bulb in the hallway exploded without anyone touching it. The stereo in the living room came on by itself and played a single, drawn-out tone, no melody, no groove, just a sustained note no one recognized from any tape in the deck. In the kitchen, a glass reportedly slid off a table and shattered on the floor, even though no one was close enough to bump it. Everyone froze. Rick didn't flinch. He walked straight into the studio room, set up in the house, and began recording what fans and insiders would later refer to as the missing take. It was a raw, frantic riff built on a bass groove he said had come to him while he was locked in that room. One witness claimed Rick kept muttering between jagged breaths, "He gave it to me. He gave it to me," over and over like a mantra. When Teena asked who he was, Rick just smiled in a way she never forgot and said, "You'll understand later." But the worst part, according to those who heard it, didn't happen while he was playing. It happened when they played the tape back. At the 17-second mark, buried deep beneath the bass line, there was a faint whisper of voice. It wasn't Rick's. It wasn't Teena's. It wasn't anyone else in the room that night. Just 4 quiet words. "Do it, Rick. Do it." The engineer rewound the tape once, then twice, then 7 times in total. The whisper was always there. Same tone, same timing, same impossible presence threaded through the static. Rick reportedly told him to erase it immediately. The engineer tried. The file glitched, the tape corrupted, but, according to the story, the whisper never fully disappeared. 2 weeks later, that same engineer quit Motown completely and left Los Angeles without offering a clear explanation. He later told a friend that he had seen something in that house that didn't belong to this world. Rick never spoke publicly about that night in the Hollywood Hills, but people close to him said everything in his life seemed to tilt after it. The drugs got heavier, his behavior grew stranger, his temper sharpened like broken glass. And late at night, in recording studios or cramped backstage dressing rooms, people noticed Rick staring into empty corners, moving his lips as if speaking to something hovering just outside everyone else's vision. In Teena Marie's mind, whatever offer had been on the table that night felt accepted. She would spend the next 25 years trying to understand what she believed she'd witnessed. Because from that moment on, Rick James didn't rise on talent alone. Something else rose with him. Something he couldn't control. Something he couldn't outrun. Something, Teena said, that just kept coming back. Everything tilted on August 10th, 1981. Rick James was in Los Angeles, rapping sessions for Street Songs, the record that would end up defining his career, when his body finally gave out. He had spent the previous night drifting from one Beverly Hills party to another, carried on a blur of cocaine, cognac, adrenaline, and ego. Around 3:40 a.m., somewhere in a corridor at the Peninsula Hotel, his body hit the floor. Witnesses later described his frame jerking violently, while paramedics battled to pull his heartbeat back into rhythm. His eyes rolled back, his fingers curled into claws. But what unsettled them most, supposedly, wasn't the overdose itself. It was the way Rick kept staring past the paramedics, over their shoulders, as if something stood just behind them, waiting. At 3:58 a.m., the ambulance doors swung open at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The corridors reeked of bleach and metal, the signature smell of survival and loss. As the gurney rattled underneath the fluorescent tubes, the lights flickered in a way that made some nurses glance up nervously. They rushed him into ICU room 214. A young nurse named Carter, whose interview later quietly circulated on musician forums, said Rick didn't arrive fighting the staff or the drugs. He arrived fighting something we couldn't see. He clawed downward, not outward, nails scraping the metal railings as he screamed, "Get him off me! He's pulling me down." Carter tried to calm him, to ground him in the room, but Rick's eyes were focused somewhere else entirely under the bed, at the shadows layered on the shiny floor. According to her account, he cried like he was watching a hand reach up that no one else could see. His heart crashed twice before sunrise. Each time the monitors flatlined, staff felt the temperature in the room dip sharply, enough that another nurse complained she could see her own breath. At 4:12 a.m., the heart monitor suddenly spiked on its own before any direct intervention, something Carter said she had almost never seen unless a patient wasn't alone in whatever space they were hovering in. By the time the sun pushed a weak light through the hospital windows, Rick lay unconscious in the bed, his chest lifting in painful, uneven pulls of air, his skin washed out under the unflattering, buzzing fluorescence. Doctors told Teena Marie that he might not live to see the end of the day. She arrived at 7:23 a.m., hair still wet from the shower she'd rushed through, and stopped cold in the doorway of room 214. She later claimed the air inside felt thick, dense, like stepping into someone else's nightmare. When Teena moved closer to the bed, Rick's eyelids fluttered. He opened his eyes briefly, pupils blown wide, his breath trembling. In a ragged whisper, he said, "He came for me. He came to collect." Teena grabbed his hand on instinct, but Rick flinched away, jerking his arm back and fixating on the far corner of the room where the shadows pooled under a wall cabinet. Teena later told a friend that Rick wasn't just staring into empty space. She believed he was looking directly at someone. At 9:06 a.m., a respiratory therapist entered to adjust the ventilator settings. Years later, in a private statement, he swore he saw a dark shape move behind the curtain dividing the room. Not a nurse. Not a reflection. Something heavier, as if the shadow had weight. Yet the ICU cameras didn't show a person. They only captured static 10 seconds of scrambled image that, according to a technician, appeared nowhere else in the ICU that morning except in Rick's room. Once Rick stabilized around noon, he did something that stayed with Teena forever. He asked for a pen and paper. His hands shook so hard he couldn't steady himself, so Teena held the clipboard for him. Slow, jagged and uneven, he wrote just 2 words and then finished the sentence. Not dead, protected. He wouldn't explain what that meant. He wouldn't elaborate who or what he thought was doing the protecting. After that, he mostly shut down. He lay there, refusing long conversations, retreating into a silence that felt more like negotiation than rest. But each time Teena stepped out to fetch water or talk to a doctor, she returned to find him staring at the ceiling tiles or the space beneath the bed, tracking something with his eyes as though it were moving along the edges of the room just out of her sight. 5 days later, Rick James was discharged. Staff felt a kind of collective relief. For them, it was one more close call in an endless string of emergencies. For Teena, it felt like something unfinished had just walked out with him. Rick stepped through the doors of Cedars-Sinai on August 15, 1981, carrying not just a fragile body, but the same phrase he'd used since that Hollywood Hills night. I can't go back now. Whatever he believed followed him into the hospital. Whatever presence he claimed tried to drag him under that bed never left. It clung to him like the smell of antiseptic on his clothes. And Teena Marie would later admit that from that day forward, Rick James didn't just fear the drugs he couldn't quit or the self-destruction he couldn't outrun. He feared something else entirely. Something that wanted him dead, but, in his mind, still couldn't quite touch him. After the night of the offer and the ICU encounter in 1981, Rick James walked back into recording studios like a man split down the middle, half anchored in the world everyone else could see, half tethered to something only he acknowledged. To the public, he was still the same explosive, commanding funk star setting Los Angeles on fire. Loud, magnetic, untouchable. But to the few people who actually lived in his orbit, especially Teena Marie, there was something different hanging around him now. Something heavier. It was as if the air around Rick carried its own shadow. By 1983, that shadow stopped hiding. It began revealing itself in the very spaces where Rick felt most powerful. Studios were Rick James' sanctuary. That was where he worshipped bass lines, where he disappeared into drum patterns, where he felt invincible. But around November 1983, strange disturbances started rippling through Record Plant, the legendary studio where he liked to work. At first, they were the kind of things people brushed off. A sudden drop in temperature even though the air conditioning was off. A faint high ringing echoing in the booth when every piece of equipment was muted. A low vibration humming through the floorboards for a few seconds at a time, like a subway passing under a building that didn't sit over any tracks. Engineers joked about old wiring, tired ears, long nights. But the longer Rick stayed there, the more the disturbances seemed to sharpen, to grow more purposeful. It felt, to some who were there, like whatever was lurking had figured out how to make itself known. On the night of November 18th, 1983, Rick was in the booth tracking new vocals. Teena Marie sat in the lounge nearby, pen in hand, silently marking corrections on a lyric sheet. Around 12:40 a.m., the whole building felt unnervingly still. Even the constant hum of Sunset Boulevard traffic, always present, even at night, sounded strangely distant, as if the city itself had pulled away and was watching from farther back. Teena suddenly heard Rick's voice on the monitor break mid-phrase. Not like a singer's crack, not a missed note, but a sound like someone choking on fear. She looked up and saw the engineer frozen in place, staring wide-eyed at the levels on the screen, instead of reaching for the console. Something was wrong. When Teena stepped into the hallway, she braced herself for the familiar chaos. Rick cursing, pacing, maybe knocking over a mic stand like he sometimes did when frustration got the best of him. Instead, the corridor was silent. Too silent. She reached the glass window outside the booth and saw Rick standing unnaturally still. His arms hung rigid by his sides, his shoulders tense, his body locked like a statue. He wasn't facing the microphone. He wasn't looking at the control room. He was staring directly into the darkest corner of the booth, eyes fixed on a patch of empty space, as though someone was there, waiting. The engineer tapped the talkback button and asked if he was okay. Rick's reply came out so soft, the room mic barely caught it. Teena pressed her ear against the glass. That's when she heard him clearly. "He's in here again." Right then, the overhead lights flickered once, then twice, then died. The entire booth snapped into darkness. The only light in the control room was a single red diode pulsing on the console, beating like an artificial heart in the black. Someone behind Teena gasped. Someone else whispered a curse. No one moved. A few seconds stretched into something longer. Finally, the emergency backup light sputtered to life. When the pale glow flooded the booth, Rick was no longer standing. He was crouched on the floor in the center of the room, arms wrapped tightly across his chest, his head shaking as if he was trying to dislodge something from his mind. Teena rushed in and felt it immediately, the drop in temperature, the way the air clung to her skin. It felt like walking into a refrigerated vault. Rick's skin was ice cold to the touch, and his eyes kept darting back toward that same corner, as though something tall and formless hovered just outside the edge of human sight. That night, they ended the session early. The fear didn't end with it. It followed them. By March 1984, Rick had shifted much of his recording into Motown's Los Angeles studio, especially a notorious space known as the Red Room. The room was famous among musicians for its almost unnaturally dry sound, no echo, no warmth, no forgiving reverb. Artists loved the precision. Engineers, on the other hand, quietly hated being in there past midnight. They said the room didn't feel right after dark. The angles felt off. The silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like someone holding their breath. On March 27th, while layering vocal tracks, the engineer heard something that stopped him cold. Under Rick's main vocal, buried low in the frequencies, there was a second voice. It wasn't a harmony. It wasn't bleed from another mic. It wasn't tape hiss. It was a whisper, tucked perfectly beneath Rick's breathing, almost like it was coaching him. Curious and uneasy, the engineer isolated the frequency and pushed the gain higher. The speakers filled with a soft, unsettling murmur unraveling through a veil of static. Then the words became clear. "Do it again." The engineer tore the headphones off his head like they were burning him. Teena burst into tears without fully understanding why. Rick didn't panic. He didn't even look surprised. He just smiled and said, "It's just encouragement." The joke didn't land. And from that moment, people stopped laughing. Through the summer of 1984, the incidents stacked up. On July 9th, around 2 a.m., a sharp chemical stink like sulfur, like something burnt and unnatural, seeped into the studio. It hit all at once, thick enough to sting the nose. A janitor swore he saw smoke coiling under the booth door, even though no equipment was overheating, no wires were frayed, nothing was visibly wrong. When he swung the door open, expecting flames or sparks, the booth was calm. No fire, no smoke. Just Rick, standing perfectly still under the overhead light, staring up at the ceiling. Teena later said his eyes looked wrong that night, glassy, distant, like they didn't belong to him. They looked borrowed, she recalled. The smell vanished the second the door opened. No trace, no source. But Rick spoke without shifting his gaze. He doesn't like breaks. From then on, whatever was in those rooms wasn't just haunting the sessions. It behaved, in Rick's mind, like it was participating. The most disturbing shift came in February 1985. Rick showed up to the studio late one night, hands trembling, muttering about him getting closer. Teena followed him into the lounge, trying to steady him, trying to get him to sit down. When he shrugged off his leather jacket, she saw them. Long, raw scratch marks carved down his back. 4 parallel lines, too deep to blame on a wardrobe malfunction, too deliberate to dismiss as an accident, too human to laugh off as his imagination. When she touched them, Rick flinched hard, like they weren't just fresh wounds, but open reminders. He refused to explain how they got there, refused medical treatment, refused to talk about it at all. Instead, he lit a joint with shaky fingers, inhaled slow, and let out a ragged exhale that sounded more like surrender than relief. "You don't run from the one who gives you the gifts," he murmured. Teena would replay that sentence in her head for the rest of her life. She said Rick didn't sound scared in that moment, he sounded resigned. Later that same year, a Motown intern stumbled onto an unlabeled reel tucked away among other tapes. Curious, he loaded it up. There was no song on it, no music, no chatter, just slow, rhythmic breathing, long inhales, longer exhales, each cycle paced with unsettling precision, like something counting silently in the dark. At the 3:14 mark, a whisper cut through the sound, "James." Then another phrase followed, warped and distorted beyond recognition, but unmistakably a voice. The intern listened 3 times. Then, shaking, he destroyed the tape. But he could never forget how the whisper felt like it wasn't coming through the speakers at all, but like someone had leaned directly up against his ear. By 1986, the fear spread beyond rumor. Studio staff began refusing overnight sessions with Rick, no matter how much overtime paid. It wasn't about the drugs. They had seen worse. It wasn't about his temper. Legendary artists with volatile moods were the norm. What unnerved them was the way the rooms changed when he walked in. The way shadows seemed to stretch a little longer. The way cold pockets of air appeared out of nowhere. The constant sense that when Rick was in front of you, something else was hovering behind him. Years later, when Teena Marie finally broke her silence, she tried to summarize what those years felt like. "People think Rick James was haunted by his mistakes," she said. "They're wrong. He was haunted by something that thought it owned him. And whatever that something was, it knew exactly where to find him under the studio lights, in the Red Room, in every space where sound could be captured and replayed." The haunting, as far as Teena was concerned, was only just beginning. There's an old saying that circulates quietly among inmates. If something is already haunting you, prison doesn't trap it outside. It traps you inside with it. And according to what was later said about Rick James, he learned that in the worst possible way, he entered Folsom State Prison on November 3, 1991. The sky hung low and gray, the air dry and cold, and the guards moved him through intake like he was just another number in a long, endless line. On paper, Rick was a disgraced superstar doing time for assault and kidnapping. To the outside world, his story had become a cautionary tale. But to Teena Marie, who spoke to him on the phone the night before he surrendered, he was something else, a man convinced his unseen visitor would not stay behind. His last words to her before the cuffs clicked shut were chilling in their simplicity. "He won't stay out here. He comes everywhere I go." From the moment Rick crossed the prison gates, things felt wrong. A guard later claimed that while they processed his personal items in the intake room, the temperature dropped nearly 10 degrees in a matter of moments. Security footage from that window of time reportedly showed a faint static-like shimmer, but only in the frames where Rick stood still under the camera, not before, not after, just then. Some officers joked about a rock star curse. Others avoided lingering near him longer than necessary. Rick was assigned to cell 218, a bare concrete cage with a metal bunk bolted to the wall, a narrow slit of a window, and chipped paint peeling off in strips like burned skin. But it wasn't the bunk or the window that caught his attention. It was the far left corner behind the toilet. He would later tell Teena during a collect call that crackled with static, he was already waiting. The first incident came on the fourth night. Rick had been pacing his cell, nerves frayed, body twitching from withdrawal tremors. The overhead lights shut off at 11 p.m., sharp, plunging the block into the usual institutional darkness. But at 3:33 a.m., a time Rick reportedly always hated, the bulb in cell 218 flickered on by itself. It didn't shine a normal white or yellow. It glowed a dim, strange red, like it was running on something other than the prison's electrical grid. Rick's cellmate, a man named Cortez, jolted awake and started shouting for the guards. But the hallway cameras later showed every other light steady and unchanged. Only Rick's cell flickered with that faint furnace-like glow. Rick stood at the bars, breathing hard, staring straight into the dark corner behind the toilet. Cortez later told other inmates in the yard that Rick began whispering into the red-lit shadows. "James, James," not like he was calling himself, like he was answering to someone. By morning, Cortez demanded a transfer. The guards didn't argue. They moved him. But taking the cellmate out didn't stop what people said was happening in cell 218. In December 1991, around 1:40 a.m., two officers on a routine round claimed they heard soft talking coming from inside Rick's cell. When they peered through the slot, Rick appeared to be dead asleep, spread across the bunk, mouth open, breathing heavy. But another voice, a low masculine murmur with long unnatural pauses between syllables, seemed to echo faintly off the concrete. They unlocked the door and stepped inside. The voice stopped instantly. Both men reported feeling the air turn painfully cold, so fast and so sharp that their breath fogged in front of their faces. One of them later admitted he thought he saw a crouched shape in the corner, but when his flashlight beam hit the spot, there was nothing there. The report was written up, then quietly brushed aside as fatigue. But guards aren't easy to scare, and rumor spread fast. "James got something in there with him," they whispered on the tiers. By January 1992, Rick's behavior had shifted into something that unsettled even hardened inmates. He stopped sleeping through the night. He picked at his meals, eating in broken pieces. Sometimes he would stand in front of the metal sink, staring at his blurred reflection for long stretches, whispering incomplete phrases, as if arguing with someone standing over his shoulder. "I didn't ask for you. You can't keep me here. I already gave you what you wanted." Other times he refused to shower alone, insisting the lights flickered whenever he was left in the tiled bathroom. A correctional officer later confirmed that during one of Rick's showers, the water suddenly blasted ice cold and the overhead lights surged so violently the ballast popped. No other bathroom on the block had an issue that night, only his. Then came the night that changed everything. On March 2nd, 1992, a storm rolled over the prison, slamming the old metal gates with wind and thunder. At some point that night, the facility suffered a brief electrical outage. Emergency lights kicked in across most of the wings. Except one. DB block stayed completely black for 25 seconds. During those 25 seconds, several inmates started screaming for the guards. Later, they claimed they saw a tall silhouette glide down the corridor, moving past their cells without any sound of footsteps. They said it paused in front of cell 218. When power returned, the emergency lights snapped back to life. In cell 218, Rick James lay curled on the floor, his body twisted on its side, both hands clamped over his chest. He was whispering, over and over, "He found me. He found me." His pulse was irregular, but he refused anything beyond the minimum medical checks. The guard who walked him back to his bunk later said Rick was shaking like something had reached straight into his spine. 2 weeks later, Teena managed to visit him. At first, Rick refused to leave his cell. When he finally agreed to step into the visitation room, Teena said she barely recognized the look in his eyes. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was something hollowed out and spiritual, like he'd been fighting something every night and losing piece by piece. He leaned across the table and spoke softly so no one else could hear. "He doesn't need the studio. He doesn't need the house. He found a way in here too." Teena asked the only question that came to her. "Who?" Rick shook his head slowly. "He won't let me say his name in here." Prison psychologists labeled his fears as withdrawal trauma, paranoia, the residue of years of substance abuse and stress. On paper, it made sense. But the staff, the ones who had seen stabbings, riots, fires, and breakdowns, started changing their routes at night. Some refused to walk past cell 218 after lights out. One officer flat out told his supervisor, "It feels like stepping into someone else's nightmare." By the time Rick's sentence ended in 1996, the so-called haunting incidents had become part of Folsom's whispered history. Officers started calling them James Nights, the nights when the corridor temperature dropped only outside his cell, when the cameras picked up a strange, shimmering static around his doorframe, or when the guard dogs refused to walk past 218, digging their paws into the floor. When Rick was finally released in August 1996, the warden himself was rumored to have said, "Whatever was in there with him, I hope it leaves with him." No one laughed. Rick James stepped out through the prison gates thinner, older, and carrying a look that suggested something else had come out too, something invisible, sitting just behind his eyes. Teena met him and wrapped him in a tight hug. But later, off the record, she admitted that when he walked out, it felt like another presence stepped out behind him, something that didn't belong in sunlight, something that had followed him into the darkness and now followed him back into the world. And Rick James would spend the rest of his life trying and failing to outrun it. By the early 2000s, Rick James looked like a man who had been through too many wars. Some of those battles were public against critics, against the law, against his own reputation. Many were private against his body, his mind, his past. And then there was the one fight Teena Marie believed almost no one else understood. The battle with something he said no one else could see. After prison, after rehab, after the injuries, after the chaos had ground him down, Rick tried to piece together a quieter life, one that almost seemed borrowed from someone else. But Teena was convinced he knew one thing clearly. Whatever had walked beside him for decades wasn't fading, it was closing in. And 2004, in her eyes, was the year it came to collect. The final months of his life felt cursed to those around him. Rick shuffled between meetings, low-key studio sessions, and constant medical appointments with a restlessness he couldn't shake. Teena noticed it immediately. His eyes kept darting toward empty corners when rooms went silent. His breathing grew short whenever the house got too quiet, as if silence itself made him nervous. More than once, in a rough, hushed voice, he told her, "He's waiting. He knows I'm tired." Teena hated that word, the way he said he. No name, no explanation, just a presence. On July 23, 2004, Teena went to visit him at his home in Los Angeles. Outside, the summer heat pressed down on the city. Inside, the house felt wrong. The windows were closed. The air sat heavy and stale, like it hadn't moved in days. It was colder than it should have been, not with the gentle cool of air conditioning, but with a kind of still, old chill that didn't match the weather report. Rick sat in a recliner, shoulders collapsed inward, staring at the floor, as if the tiles held a message only he could read. When Teena asked how he was feeling, he didn't answer with words at first. He just slowly lifted a hand and pointed down the hallway. Teena later admitted she didn't see anything there. No figure, no shadow, nothing that should have caused the way her chest tightened. But she said she felt something, a shift in pressure, like the house exhaled around them. "He's been here all week," Rick whispered. "He doesn't hide anymore." For the first time in all the years she had known him through scandals, violence, headlines, and breakdowns, Teena realized she was afraid for him in a way she couldn't put into normal language. Not afraid of Rick James the man. Afraid of whatever he believed was in that hallway with them. In the week leading up to his death, unusual events were quietly reported by those closest to him. The home studio computer, which was supposed to stay off, began powering on by itself. More than once, it autoplayed an unfinished demo, just a rough track. Only this version ended with a warped, low moan in the final seconds that no one remembered recording. A housekeeper claimed she saw a shadow move smoothly across the hallway wall, even though she was the only person in the house at the time. One night, Rick woke up screaming not in pain, but in raw terror. He insisted someone had been sitting on the edge of his bed, leaning close, whispering to him in the dark. When the lights were turned on, no one was there. But the deep impression on the mattress, shaped like the weight of another body, remained. Teena visited again on August 3rd. Rick's voice was weak, frayed around the edges, but his fear was strong enough to fill the entire room. He told her, "He said the time's up. I heard him last night." Teena begged him to talk to someone, to call a doctor, a pastor, anyone who might help. Rick just shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on some invisible point she couldn't track. "Help can't stop this," he said. 2 days later, in the early hours of August 5th, a neighbor claimed they heard a loud bang from Rick's house around 1 a.m. It could have been furniture tipping, it could have been a fall. Some assumed it was just noise from inside a cluttered home. But one neighbor, a woman who lived alone next door, later said she heard something else right before the impact. A voice. A deep voice. Not screaming, not angry, just calling his real name. Not Rick, not the stage persona. James. On the morning of August 6, 2004, Rick James was found dead in his bedroom. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac failure. The toxicology report noted multiple substances in his system, but none in individually lethal doses. Nothing, on paper, that should have stopped his heart so decisively. Nothing that fully explained the expression frozen on his face, a drained mixture of exhaustion and fear, like a man who had spent the entire night struggling against something no one else in that house could see. That expression is what stayed with Teena. She told a friend off the record that she didn't believe Rick simply slipped away peacefully in his sleep, like people like to say. She believed he knew something was coming for him. She believed he felt it enter the room. And she believed that in those last moments, however they unfolded, he recognized whatever it was. When Teena saw him one last time, she noticed something she could never forget. The room was freezing. Not a little too cold from overactive air conditioning, but a deep, unnatural chill that seeped into her bones. Cold like standing in a winter cave. Cold like breath should have been visible. Cold like something else had stayed behind a little too long. She leaned close and whispered goodbye. But later she confessed it felt like she wasn't the only one listening. Months later, after enough time had passed for her to finally speak openly about the voices, the shadows, the strange nights and stranger rooms, she shared details she'd kept buried for years. She revealed something Rick had told her long before he died. "If he ever comes to collect me," he said, "you'll know. You'll feel it in the room." Teena has never publicly described exactly what she felt that day. She didn't need to. People who heard her talk about it said the look in her eyes told the rest of the story. Decades of whispers, decades of shadows, decades of encounters that never left clean answers. From the Hollywood Hills in 1978, to the ICU room in 1981, to the studios in 83 and 84, through the concrete echo of Folsom Prison, and finally to that quiet bedroom in 2004 something, according to Teena, walked beside Rick James. Something he believed gave him power, then slowly stripped everything else away. And when Teena Marie finally revealed the truth she said she'd carried for half a lifetime, many fans claimed they suddenly understood why Rick never outran his demons. In their view, he wasn't just running from addiction. He wasn't just running from fame or from his own worst decisions. He was running from a pact. A pact he believed he made. A pact he believed he couldn't break. A pact that, in his mind, eventually came to collect. So, after hearing what Teena Marie says she witnessed and carried in silence for years, what do you think really followed Rick James? Was it guilt? Was it the slow collapse of a mind worn down by excess and trauma? Or was it something far darker that began in a locked room in 1978 and never loosened its grip? Tell me in the comments which theory you believe. And if you want more of these true dark files from Black music history, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. The next story might be even darker. Just remember, some legends rise purely from talent. Others rise from